getting on indeed. Well, turnips and rare from my fingers and toes, and the mare brock and need. Pigs didn't sell at fall, and we lost elderly cow. And it beats me to know what she died on, but wolves look up anyhow. And so they made our parson, and they'll get along, never fear. For I've been a churchwarden myself in the parish for 15 years. Well, sin there be churchwardens, there mun be parsons and all. And if one stinks alongside the other, the church will happen to fall. For I were a Baptist once, and again the tithe and the rate, till they found it weren't again it's where the narrow gate. And I can't abere 'em now, I can't, for a lot of 'em come to cheer. And I were down with rheumatus then, to my pond, to wash their sins there. So I sticks like heaven to the old church now, for they wash their sins in my pond, and it doubts it poisoned the cow. Hey, and you see the bishop, there says he come from note, burnt in trade, and so they warrants he never said half that he thought, but he creeped and crawled along till he feeled he could hold his own, and he married the great Jarl's daughter, and sits on the bishop's throne. Now, I'll give thee a bit of my mind, and thou won't be taking offence. For thou now be a big scholar with 100 hacker of sense, but such an obstropolous like, nay, for I minds her so well, thou'd never not upple thy tongue, and the tongue to set fire to hell. And as I says, as my missus today, she hurled a plate of the cat, and another again my nose, yeah, was never as bad as that. But I minds when in Owlby deck one day, thou were tickling a trout. And the keeper, he seed you, and he runned, and he bailed, lad, come out. And ya stood up naked in the beck, and you tell me to know his own place. And you called him a clown, you did. And you throw the fish in his face. And he turned as red as a stack turtle's walls, but there and then I calmed him down, for I promised you'd never not do it again. And I cotched thou once in my garden when thou 8 year old, and full of my pockets are full of my pippins that ever they'd owed. And thou was parakeets out and made me as mad. And I says, keep 'em and welcome, for thou's the parson's lad. And the parson, he isn't it all, and he takes a kindly to me. And then I chose churchwarden and come to the top of the tree. For quality's all, my friends, and then makes me as help the poor, when I gets the platter fuller of Sundays, nor any churchwarden afore. For if ever thy father he rile me, I kept myself as meek as a lamb. And so by the grace of the Lord, Mr. Harry, I am what I am. But parson, he will speak out, so now he's 67. He'll never swap Outby or Scapby for out but the kingdom of heaven. And thou'll be his curate here, if that ever means to get a bit higher. But thou mun tackle the sins of the world and not the faults of the squire. And I reckons thou lot of a living as somewheres the wold of the fen. And thou cottons, if thou cottons down to thy betters and keeps thy scent of the sen. But never speak out plain if thou wants to get furrows a bit, but creep along the edge bottoms, and thou be bishop yet. Nay, thou mun speak out to the Baptists here in the town, for most of them talks again the tithe, and I like to preach them down. For they've been a preaching me down they have, and I hates them now, for they leave their nasty sins in my pond, and it poisoned the cow.
Absolutely great. Well, I understood about 90% of it, but I've got a feeling some people, English isn't their first language, might be shaking their heads a bit.
I thought I'd do a bit of a change.
Absolutely, it's lovely to hear it again. But you do talk funny over there, don't you?
Yes.
You want to come and talk proper like we do over here in Shropshire, mate? Right, so we're into Colin next. Then we go Colin, and then after that's Heather. Then after that is Emily. Okay, so Colin, over to you, mate.
Thanks, Mike. That was great, Keith. I maybe didn't get 90% of it, but I got a lot of it. Thank God we don't talk funny over here. Anyway, I'm going to tell you we Irish tale as usual, and of course, like all these stories, it begins a long time ago. In Ireland, there was a king, and he had 3 sons. And the old chieftain loved his sons dearly, of course, and he taught them how to ride, and he taught them how to hunt. And when the eldest one came of age, he gifted him a stallion, a wolfhound, and a hawk. And so that young fella, now he was of age, he left his father's home, and he went off into the world to make his fortune, to find his way. And after many days of travel, he through the wild wood. Of course, in those days, Ireland was covered from top to bottom in a wild wood. And after many days' travel, he came to this clearing in the wood. And in the clearing, there was a stone circle in the middle of the clearing. And in the middle of the stone circle, there was a little shack, a hut that was thatched with birch, and it was made of hazel wattles. And of course, the young fella, he attended to his animals first, because he had been traveling all day and they were tired and hungry as he was. And then he gathered some firewood and he went inside the shack to light a fire and cook some food and take his rest. Well, he wasn't in the shack too long until the next thing, an old woman came to the door, and she had long white hair, and she had a few white whiskers of a beard, not as good as Keith's beard, but she had a few whiskers on her chin. And she begged for food and for shelter. And seeing that her clothes were in rags and that the weariness was on her, the young fella took pity on her. And he bid her to come in to the shack and partake of the few bits and pieces of food that he had with him. Well, she said that she would, but that she was afraid of his animals. My animals, he said, my animals will do you no harm. Maybe not, she said, but even so. And she pulled out a few strands of her long white hair and she weaved them into a braid. And she gave them to the young fella. And she said, here, take those out and tether your animals with them, and I'll be able to take my rest and dine with you. Well, the young fella saw no harm in it whatsoever. And well, he went out and he put the tethers on his animals. And when he returned, the old woman, who, when she came in, had a hump on her back and she was leaning on a stick, when he came back in the shack, she was as straight as a rush and as fresh as a young woman. And she attacked him. And she fought ferociously with him. And well, the young fella realized that he was no match for her. He couldn't fight her off. And too late, he realized that she was no ordinary old woman. She was a woman of the she. She had special powers that he was unable to defeat. And so he whistled for his hawk, and he heard the bells of his hawk tinkling furiously, but it never came to his fist. And then he called for his hound, but it never came to his side. And he shouted for his stallion, but he could hear its hooves stomping on the ground, but it never came to him. Why do you not come at my command? The young fella cried. And the animals replied, we cannot break our tethers, master. We have been enchanted by the old woman. And the old woman chanted, hair, hair, weave and snare. Hold fast my braids of hair. Well, she beat the young fella senseless. And when she had robbed him of everything of value, she dragged him outside. Blood and guts and broken bone turn them into standing stone. And the young fella took his place in that circle of cold, grey monoliths. A year passed, and the next son came of age. His father bestowed on him the same gifts of a stallion, a wolfhound, and a hawk. And he too set off into the world to try and make his fortune. And after many, many days of travel through the wild wood, he came to this clearing in the wood. And in the clearing in the wood, there was this circle of stone. And in the middle of it, there was a shack made of hazel and thatched with birch. Well, the young fella walked around the circle of stones, and he was strangely drawn to one. But anyway, like his brother before him, he attended to the animals, and he gathered some firewood, and he went inside to cook some food and take his rest. And then along came this old woman, stooped over, leaning on a stick, and her long white hair, and she begged for food and shelter. And again, she pulled the hair from her head and she braided it into a long tether. And she told the young fella to go and tether her animals with it. And of course, he didn't see any harm in it, to keep the old woman happy. And he placed them on his animals. And just as before, when he came back in, the old woman attacked him. And he summoned his animals, but they didn't come. And he said, "Why do you not come to help me when I command you?" "We cannot, master. We have been enchanted. We cannot break our tethers," they said. Well, just as before, the old woman beat him senseless, and then she robbed him of everything that he owned, and she dragged him outside. Blood and guts and broken bones turned them into standing stones. And the second brother took his place in that big circle of cold, grey monoliths. Well, a year passed. And the youngest son, well, he came of age too, and he was the old chieftain's favourite son. And his father gifted him his fastest stallion and his most faithful wolfhound and his fiercest hawk. And thus and now the young fella set off into the world to make his way and find his fortune. And he traveled many, many days through the wild wood, and he came to this clearing in the forest. And in the middle of the clearing, there was a stone circle. And in the middle of that stone circle, there was a shack made of hazel, thatched with birch. And the young fellow walked around that stone circle, and he was strangely drawn to two stones. I think Mike needs muted there.
So I'll turn it off.
Mike Faculty, could you mute yourself, Mike, please? Mike Faculty, thank you.
He was strangely drawn to two of the stones, and he didn't know why. So he just tended to his animals as his brothers had before him, and he collected some firewood. He went inside to cook some food and take his rest. And of course, he wasn't there very long until an old woman came to the door, stooped over, a stick in her hands, her long white hair, and she begged for some food. Well, the young fella bid her to enter and dine with him. She said that she was frightened of his animals, and as before, she pulled the hair from her head, and she wove them into a long braid, and she gave them to the young fella and asked him to tether his animals. Well, he went outside, and when he returned, she attacked him, and he fought for his life, but she was too many for him. He couldn't fight her off. And so he whistled for his hawk, and his hawk flew in, its bells tinkling, and it stuck its talons in the old woman's face. Its talons went through her lips and in her nose, and with its beak, it began to peck out her eyeballs. She was blinded, and she started floundering around the place. And then he whistled for his dog, and his wolfhound came running in. It could see the old woman, but sensing that his master was in danger, it sunk its teeth into the old woman's backside. And with a shake of its head, it tore strips of flesh off her buttocks and off her legs. And she cried out in agony. And then the young fella whistled for his horse. His horse came running in. And with its two back hoofs, it lashed out and it struck the old woman right in the chest and drove her out through the hazel walls of that old shack. And she landed with a sickening crack and crash of bones. Hair, weave and snare. Why did you not hold fast my braids of hair? And then just then, she smelt the stench of burning hair, and she realized that young fella had thrown her braids in the fire and that she was undone. Well, the young fella went outside with his sword. He meant to finish her off. Please, she said, spare me, and I will return your two brothers. Stones, standing stones, turn back in to flesh and bones. Well, there was a flash of light, a clap of thunder, and two of the stones turned to dust, and there, naked on the ground, was the young fella's two older brothers. Well, to cut a long story short, reunited, they decided that they would set off home to see their father again and perhaps never leave him in their lives again. And as they were beginning to ride off, the old woman cried, please, take pity on me. Do not leave me here like this. I beg you, the wild animals will only devour me. And feeling pity for her, they decided to give her the same treatment as she had given them. And the two older brothers cried out, blood and guts and broken bone, turn them in to standing stone. And the old woman took her place in that circle of cold grey monoliths. And so if you are ever in Ireland and you come across one of the many stone circles that we have here, look around, look for a stone that is smaller or more slender than the rest. If you stand beside it and you can detect the faintest whiff of burning hair, it might be that you're standing beside that old woman who was turned to stone all those years ago. And if you are, you'll probably feel a shiver go right down your spine.
Oh. Lovely, Colin, beautiful.
Thank you, Meg.
Yeah, that's lovely. I love stories about standing stones. I've got one as well. I might see if I can get it in later. Right, so we go to Heather. From Heather, we go to Emily. And from Emily, we'll go to Baba. Okay?
Okay, oh, fantastic. That was great, Colin. And I had a couple of stories in my mind, and I was hoping that your story would inspire what I was going to tell. And so this one is what I think you've heard this before, Colin, but I'm sure you'll forgive me for that. But I am, as some of you know, I'm a harp player, a music teacher, and I do a lot of traveling around Scotland. And I used to, for many, many years, maybe about 20 years, I was teaching every other weekend up in the Inverness area. And to start with, we had a venue, we had a place along the River Ness in the centre of the city to teach from. But then we got sort of shunted out. And so I started going round everyone's houses. And that was amazing because I got to travel right round the whole of Inverness Shire and got to know a lot of villages and places on the Black Isle and across Bewley and up north to Dingwall and Allness and Tain and then at one point south along the southern part of Loch Ness. Now, Loch Ness is famous the world over. Even if you don't know where it is in Scotland, you've maybe heard of the Loch Ness monster. But Loch Ness is quite a amazing loch. It has lots of stories and lots of creatures, not just Loch Ness monster. There's water horses and there's all sorts of other creatures associated with that loch. And this is a story that I just took my imagination when I heard it, and it takes place at a wee village that I used to drive through on my way to teach harp lessons along one of these narrow roads in Scotland where it winds along, and it's a single track road, so when you see people coming you have to go into the passing place to let folk pass. And it's a wee village called Daughters, and quite close to there, along the shore of Loch Ness, there's a forest. And it was a beautiful forest, and lots of different animals and creatures like to use that as their sort of favourite place, and especially the wild horses. There was a lot of wild horses back then that roamed the glens and the mountainsides, and there was always horses to be found in that wee forest, in that wee woodland. But some said that there was also not just the sort of shaggy ponies of the sort of wild horses of Scotland, but there was also a yellow stallion, as what it was described as, that was dangerous. It wasn't a water horse, it wasn't a kelpie, but it was just as dangerous. Because sometimes people disappeared, and usually it was young men that would vanish, and people locally blamed their disappearance on this yellow horse. So there was this one day when these two brothers were going down to the loch to go fishing. And as they left their house, they heard their father shouting, "Beware of the yellow horse, remember. Keep your eyes open." They just shrugged and laughed to each other, because I mean they've been hearing this story about this yellow horse all their days, and they just thought it was nonsense, just like stories about fairies and giants and things, just stories for children. But they went down to the loch and they started fishing, and they were getting on quite well. And later in the day, suddenly there was a sort of rustling in the undergrowth, and they turned and they looked, and there approaching them was this beautiful stallion. I mean, it was the most magnificent horse that they'd ever seen. And it could be described as yellow, which they'd never seen a horse that with this shade, this colouring, but it was absolutely beautiful. I mean, the mane and the tail were just magnificent, and it had the saddest, softest eyes, and it just sort of came up very slowly and not threatening and I mean the older boy, I mean he loved horses, and he just couldn't help himself. He went over to it and he just thought, oh, this can't be the horse that they talk about. This animal isn't dangerous. I wonder if I could get a wee ride on it. What a magnificent beast it is. And so he leapt up onto the back of that horse. And as soon as he did, he realised his mistake, because he was frozen, absolutely frozen on the back of that horse, as if he was glued on. His younger brother approached, stretched out his hand to stroke the silky neck of that beautiful, beautiful horse. His older brother shouted out a warning, don't don't touch. But it was too late, for the younger brother's fingertips had just started to brush the neck, to stroke that neck, and they were glued to the horse. The young lad didn't know what to do, and he pulls out of his pocket his knife, his penknife, and there was only one thing he could do. Without thinking too hard about it, he cut off his fingers and freed himself from the horse. The horse saw that cold steel, saw the knife, and it panicked, it shrieked, and it started to gallop with the older brother still on its back into the woods. Well, the younger brother, it was obviously, blood was dripping everywhere, but he was in such a panic about his older brother. He knew he had to do something. So he looked about, and there was some leaves of a plant that he knew that some of the wise women sometimes used, figwort, and he took the leaves and he wrapped them round the ends of his fingertips, and he started running. But before he followed the track of that horse, he knew that his older brother had brought with him a short sword. And so he picked up that sword, and he started to follow that horse. He started running through the forest, following the tracks of that horse. He knew how to follow tracks, and it was easy because the horse had been running so fast, had been galloping, that there was a clear marking where he'd gone. And so he followed, and he followed, and he ran the rest of that afternoon until early evening. He came to this clearing, and there was a small lochan, and there beside the lochan, beside the water, was the horse. It was resting, and on its back was still his brother. And that young lad, he saw that, and with a roar and a shout, ran with that sword, and he chopped off the horse's head. One blow. His brother fell from the back of that horse and was able to scramble to his feet. He was free. He'd been saved. But there was no horse. Instead, lying there was a young man who got to his feet, and he had those soft, sad eyes and blonde, curly hair. And he smiled at the young lad and he said, "Thank you. Thank you so much. I have been enchanted for longer than I know." And it was only a young lad that had never before struck a blow with a sword that could break the enchantment. And you have done it. And I thank you. And he took the young boy's hand, the injured hand, in his, and he held it, and then returned the hand. And when he returned it, the hand was whole. And the boys went back home, their direction, and that young lad disappeared off into the woods, the blonde-haired stranger, and he was never seen again.
Well, we're getting some really cool stories tonight. Fair play. That was lovely, Heather. Thank you very much. Right. So we're going to go to Emily. From Emily, we're going to Baba, and from Baba to Susan.
Okay, so my story is different in tone than the rest of you all, so I hope that won't bother anyone, but this is a Brayer rabbit tale. So Brayer rabbit is cousin to Anansi and Coyote. So if you know them, you know him. So one fine fresh morning in the middle of May, Brayer Rabbit was going down an old country road with the tall grasses on the side, and he was shooting the breeze and catching that pleasant air when suddenly, out of the grasses, shoo, someone grabbed Brayer Rabbit and hoisted him up in the air and said, "I got you now, Brayer Rabbit, and I'm going to eat you whole." Now, hold on there, Brayer Fox, says Brayer Rabbit, because that was Brayer Fox I was holding up, says, "What you said you was going to do to me? Can't you hear with them big old ears of yours, Brayer Rabbit? I said I was going to eat you whole." "And then what?" says Brayer Rabbit to Brayer Fox. "Huh? And then what, Brayer Fox? You're going to eat me, and then 2-3 hours you're going to go back behind that bush there, and then 2-3 hours you're going to be hungry again. Don't you get tired of doing that every single day, Brayer Fox, 3 times a day? Don't you get tired?" And Brayer Fox, oh, he's pretty smart, but he don't think too hard. He thought to himself, "Well, maybe I do. What you say? What should I do about that, Brayer Rabbit?" And Brayer Rabbit says, "Well, you could sew yourself up." Sew yourself up, says Brayer Rabbit to Brayer Fox. "Now listen, you've seen myself. I don't go around like your own self, or Brayer Bear, or Brayer Wolf going around grabbing people out of these old country roads and eating them whole. Well, that's because I sewed myself up." And Brayer Fox, he thinks to himself, he never did think very hard. He said to himself, "Well, Brayer Rabbit, sew me up." And so Brayer Rabbit did. And that worked pretty well, actually, for a few days. Brayer Fox would eat less and less, and he'd be fuller and fuller. Well, a few days pass, and they meet once again on that old country road. Says, "Howdy do, Brayer Rabbit." "Howdy do, Brayer Fox." And Brayer Rabbit, he had in his hand a packet of freshly roasted peanuts, with the salt and the seasoning, and it was giving off the most delicious aroma. Well, when you find yourself at a feast, and you've eaten literally everything there is to have in that feast, the chair table, the drumsticks, but you smell one last delicious aroma, and you just have to have that last bite. Well, Brayer Fox, he saw red. He grabbed that packet out of Brayer Rabbit's hand, poured that thing down his gullet, and pow! Exploded all over the road. And Brayer Rabbit, he laughed himself silly. He says, "Well, Brayer Fox, I always knew you were full of it." And he turned around laughing all the way home to his dinner. And that's the end of that.
That's lovely, Emily, and thank you very much. Where have you gone? You've disappeared. Oh, you're still there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, wait. Yeah. Thank you very much, Emily. But we have a little story over here about a farmer that lived up in the Welsh hills, and he had a donkey. And he thought, well, it's far too much to keep feeding this donkey every day, so I'm going to feed it sawdust. But you can't just feed a donkey sawdust every day. You have to train the donkey just to eat the sawdust. So it took him a whole year. Slowly, for a whole year, he gave the donkey a little bit more sawdust and a little bit less hay and food. And at the end of the year, it died. Right, so we'll go to Baba next.
Wait a minute, it died? That was the end of the story.
That's the end of the story, yeah.
Right? Oh, does that qualify as an asinine story?
Well,
okay.
I don't know what it qualifies as.
But I found myself liking it. Emily, thank you for that wonderful story. As you know, I love Anansi story. I love trickster stories. So Anansi, Coyote, Fox, and Brayer Rabbit, they're all tricksters. But it's nice when one trickster gets over on another. So Asante Sana, thank you very much. Now, the story I'm going to tell, I can't tell you whether it was true or not, or whether or not it was true. It will not begin with once upon a time, and I cannot promise it will end with happily ever after. But I do know that the story, more than thrice told, has Yoruba, Ashanti, and a lot of African American intertwined, with a dash of Swahili. You see, before any of us were born, in fact, before the sum total of all of our ages is when this story took place. Now, there was a king who you might hear me refer to as Mafalmi or Oba The first was Swahili. The second was Yoruba. Oba's easier, so I'm going to go with Oba. There was a king named Oba Ade. And Ade means crown. Now, this king was, to put it politely, full of himself. He thought that just because when he was young, barely a prince, and his parents sent him afar to learn at the feet of many a masters, and upon his return, when he became king, that he was the wisest, most intelligent person in all of his kingdom. I mean, no one else had the education he had, so he had to be the wisest. He had to be the most intelligent. But every day he kept hearing about a young boy who some people call Undogo Umaye Basare, which means wise brother or brother wise. And he kept hearing that this boy was the wisest person in all of the kingdom. Well, King Ade was not having this. He was king. He was the wisest, and everyone should know this. He had to bring this upstart to him and teach him his place. So he sent for him. Now, the young brother's name was Quado or Quajo. And Quajo means born on Monday. And people born on Monday were said to have an affinity for philosophy and thinking. The king had him brought before him and says, "How dare you? How dare you call yourself the wisest person in this kingdom? Do you know not who I am? I am King Ade." And Quajo said, "Oh, my Oba, my king, I have never said I was the wisest person in this kingdom. People come to me with their problems or challenges, and I ponder, and I think, and often I'm able to give them a solution for what vexes them, for what challenges them. They call me the wise brother. They say I am the wisest. I have never uttered those words until this moment." The king says, "I think you are toying with me, little boy. So I'm going to show once and for all that you are not the wisest in this kingdom, that I, King Ade, am the wisest. And I have tasks for you. Return here tomorrow, and I'll give you your first task. And to be fair, I will call upon others of your age to partake in the task." And so the next day, shortly after the sun had risen, the king, in his courtyard, brought forth Brother Wise and boys around his age. He says, "This is the first task. Each of you must go fishing, and at the end of the day, bring me the largest catch." And he gave each boy a net. And he gave Brother Wise a net. And he said, "Be gone. I will see you tomorrow." "Nope, I'll see you at the end of the day." And so Brother Wise examined his net. Unlike the other nets, his net, the webbing was so wide that nothing could be caught in it. When he got back to his compound, he sat and he pondered. He pondered and he sat. He sighed. And then he pondered some more. And then it hit him. So he took some of the tall grass that grew wild in the jungle, and he took vines, and he set upon repairing this net that he had been given, and making the spaces between them smaller and smaller. And then he went fishing, and indeed he caught a great catch. In fact, it was so heavy, he had to get one of his brothers to help him carry it back to the king. And when he put his catch before the king was astonished, astounded, furious. For how dare this boy, who is yet a man, outthink the king of the land? He said, "You've done well, but I have another task. I want you to bring me a jug of palm oil." And he gave each of the boys a palm plant. And he gave Brother Wise a palm plant. Now, the palm plants he had given the other boys were actually trees. And the one he had given Brother Wise was dead. He said, "When I call upon you, you must bring me a jug of palm oil." And so the boys dispersed. Brother Wise went back to his compound. He thought, he pondered, and he thought. He thought and he pondered, and he sighed while he was thinking some more. Now, I have to tell you something about Brother Wise. He was a very smart person who spoke many, many different languages, including the languages of some of the animals that lived in their kingdom. And around his compound, there was a flock of birds who understood human language. And they heard Brother Wise thinking aloud, and they thought, well, he's nice to us. When there's no food to be had, he leaves us out seeds for us to eat, which is why we never, ever eat the seeds in his garden, and why we never destroy his harvest. We must do something for this young man. And so they all flew and scattered, and shortly they returned, each with a few seeds, but this is a flock of birds, and they laid at the wise brother feet many, 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 many seeds, enough for him to press and squeeze and press until he had a jug of palm oil. When the king called forth, all the boys came, and they had half a jug, 3/4 a jug, a little bit of jug. But wise brother had a full jug of palm oil. Now the king could not admit that he had given wise brother a dead palm tree, but he was determined that he was going to show this boy for the charlatan he had to be. And so he said, one last test to see if indeed you are wise as people claim you to be. And he gave each boy a goat and a chicken. Brother Wise examined his goat, and whereas the other boys had gotten a nanny goat, the king had given him a billy, a male goat. And whereas the other boys had been given hens, the king had given him a rooster. He said, when I call for you, you'll return and bring me milk and eggs, at least 2. Brother Wise went home. He sat and he thought and he sat, and he thought some more. The king called for all the boys to come to his compound, and all the boys showed early in the morning except for Brother Wise. Where is Brother Wise? No one knew. Where is Brother Wise? No one knew. He has until the midday to appear before me, or I will send my guards to fetch him, and he will be in trouble. And just as the midday sun hit its zenith in the sky, Brother Wise came running, sweating, huffing and puffing. He stood before the king. He knelt. He said, "Oh my Oba, oh my king, please forgive me. I didn't mean to be late, but I couldn't help it. You see, last night my father gave birth, and he was so weak he couldn't feed my new brother. So I fed my father the eggs from the rooster you gave me, and I fed the baby boy, my new brother, the milk from the goat." And the king says, "Do you take me for some kind of fool? Men cannot have babies." But your king, men not have babies, roosters cannot lay eggs, and billy goats cannot be milked. The king realized what he had just done and said. And rather than admit that he was trying to deliberately trick, deliberately insult, deliberately embarrass Wise brother, he said, "You have proven my point. Indeed, you are wise. In fact, you are so wise, I want you to sit on my council and advise me and these other advisors, and let us rule over my land more prosperously." Well, Wise brother became the griot to the king. And as many may know, the king often serves as advisor, for they are charged with speaking truth and demonstrating the folly of other people's ways. And the king, when asked the griot to give advice, to advise him, cannot touch the griot for any reason. For you see, Wise brother did indeed prove that he was the wisest person in the kingdom. And Oba Ade learned that he was not maybe as wise as he thought he was, but he was wise enough to have brother Wisdom, Brother Wise, as a friend and advisor, and not an enemy. The lesson in the story is wisdom, intelligence, they're not always what you think they are, but they can always be utilized to help improve the lives of others. Asante.
Great. Thank you very much, Bubba. That's great. As always, that's great. Right, so
Asante
we go
Sane,
to
thank you.
Susan next. So Susan she's going to tell a story from South Africa, she tells me, yeah?
Yeah. For a change, yes, Mike. It's about time we have a story from South Africa, I think. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay, so just Baba, just remind me one day to tell you the story of wisdom versus idiots. I think you'll enjoy that one.
Only if you let
Okay.
me tell my version as well.
Okay, fantastic.
I've got a version of that as well, but go on.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, so this goes back quite some time. Mike, this is a story that my great-grandmother told me. Now, my great-grandmother couldn't read or write, but she could tell great stories. And this one, she said, was told to her by a distant relative. Let's call him Jan. And he was on his way from a little town called Bethlehem to a town in the Free State then called Linley. I don't know what business he was going to do. He was on horseback as usual. And this area between Bethlehem and Linley, at the foot of the Drakensberg Mountains, is as flat as a sheet. Absolutely beautiful. No trees, just grassland. And of course, when there's a thunderstorm, you can see it coming. You can hear the thunder, you can see the lightning dance in the sky. And on this particular day, Jan saw the lightning and thunder, and then the rains started rolling towards him until after a few minutes, he was soaked through. He was exhausted, and so was his horse. His horse's name was Hetty. And he decided to get off Hetty, and in this horrible rain and thunderstorm, he saw a light in the distance. And he said, with relief, maybe this is a place for me to hide in the rain. And he walked towards this light. He came across a homestead board, saying the name of the homestead. It was called Lekker Sing. That translates into sing with joy. So as he walked up to the house leading his horse, he saw the whole farm was lit up. He heard loud music, people playing the finger piano, people singing loudly. The wagon house was lit up, the house was lit up. And Jan noticed very, very quickly that everyone in the house was as drunk as can be. In fact, they were toasting the rafters and toasting the war and toasting their wives and toasting everybody else, but nobody made any sense. So as he walked towards the house, this beautiful young girl walked up to him, saw that he was soaked from head to toe, and took him by the hand, took him into the house, offered him a dry shirt. Of course, she wanted to help him to change the shirt, but he was a proper man, said, no ways, I've been changing my shirt since I was 4 years old. I can do it by myself, thank you. And eventually he walked into the kitchen. Now there, of course, everybody was drunk. The beautiful woman was sitting on the table or on the laps of men, toasting away, drinking away. And this young man walked up to him and offered him a drink. He said to him, my friend, we can't offer you any food. The rain had put out all the fires. The pot bread is finished, but please have some of our local bread alcohol. So Jan said he had a couple of swigs, but the stuff was so strong that within minutes he felt as if he was hanging from the rafters, and he sort of doodled over to where he could find a bed, fell down on the bed, covered himself with the eiderdown, and eventually, to the loud thumping and the noise of the dancing and the singing, he fell asleep. So the following day he woke up, and he was woken up by sunlight in his face. He was quite surprised, had a horrible headache, looked around a bit, and sat up, found himself outside on a burnt out foundation made of cow dung. And there around him was this beautiful little chicken and going pick, 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 making a real nuisance of herself, walking up to him and going pick, 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 pick. And Jan was really worried, stood up, looked around, thought, oh my goodness, where's my horse? Tried to chase this little hen away. He was going pick, 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 pick. Walked around and eventually stumbled across the skeleton. Looked down and saw it was his horse's skeleton, and he got such a fright. He thought, my goodness, how on earth did this happen? But then he looked and saw in the distance, he saw his horse Hetty. She still had a saddle on. Jan was so relieved. He thought that this skeleton must have been put there by the farmer's wife to chase the hawks away, because in case the hawks wanted to catch the little chicks. And he looked at this little hen and he said to her, "Yeah, old hen, looks like it's only the two of us who survived this night." And the little hen pecked away for a bit. And then she looked at him and she said to him, "My name is Miss Vermaak, and I dance through the night in the dark." Jan says, thank heavens Hetty still had a saddle on her back, because he sort of came to his senses about 6 hours later. Said he arrived at a homestead where he was welcomed with typical South African hospitality. And the farmer told him the story of Lekkerson. He said, over a cup of coffee and some nice rusks, he said, you know, that Lekkerson place, that is a den of iniquity. And those people, they got what they deserved. About 2 years ago, lightning struck the farmstead and everything burned down. And the people in the house and in the wagon house were so drunk that they couldn't escape. And they all burned to death. And Oom Jan sort of said with relief, yeah, I'm glad that's what they deserved if they were such sinful people. And he took a sip of coffee and he spilled some of the rusk on his shirt and he started brushing down his shirt. And when he looked down, he noticed that he was wearing a shirt that he had never seen before. And there ended my story.
Ooh. That was lovely. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Oh, that takes the breath away from me. So we're going to Diana next, but then I've got a couple of people there, Norman and Mike, wherever you are. Are you two telling stories tonight? Put your hand up. One for Mike. Norman, are you going to have a bash?
How much time do we have?
About 3 days.
I asked the same question and I got the same answer last time. Okay, you think I'd learn? Okay.
Yeah, we always got.
I think I'll have a story. It'll be a short one.
So that's fine. Actually, what about you, Valentina? No, you're just listening. That's fine. Okay. So I'm going to go to Diana, then I'm going to go to Mike, and from Mike I'm going to go to Norman. Okay. So Diana.
Okay, right, here we go. There's been quite a lot of animal stories tonight, so I'm going to carry that on.
Right.
And this story takes place a very, 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 very long time ago, before the technological revolution, when people were much more in tune with the land, where they made their work was on the land, and they grew their crops on the land. They were much more at home in a natural environment. and everyone had to pull their weight. Well, this is set in a village in Wales, like I say, a long time ago. And there was Sir Brandon. He was at the top. He was the master. He looked down on the village and he demanded high taxes, and the people were hard pressed to pay them. But still, he wanted his way of life. He had Brangwen Hall and he loved to hunt. He absolutely loved to hunt. On the wall in Brangwen Hall, there were bear skins, antlers, there was even a wolf. And he so wanted to get an enchanted animal, maybe a basilisk, maybe a griffin, maybe a dragon, maybe a unicorn. And they said that there used to be these magical enchanted animals in the forest nearby, but they were no longer there. Some said they were, but just no one knew how to find them anymore. They didn't have the proper skills. So who really knew? Well, there was a young girl, Rhiannon, who was 9 years old, and she stayed with her grandparents out of necessity, because Sir Brangwen, who loved hunting, who demanded all the high taxes, had her father imprisoned on a false charge. He was charged with stealing a deer, which he never had done. But that was the way Sir Brangwen worked. All the very bright men, all the very able men were imprisoned on cocked up charges so that they couldn't rise up and revolt against him and his crooked ways. And Rhiannon's mother, she was in the kitchen. She had to cook all his food. And she was kept there against her will too. And Rhiannon wasn't allowed to see either of them. Well, she stayed with her grandparents and she involved herself with all the tasks about the house. They were really just wooden huts. They were their dwelling place. And while her grandmother would go off to work the land, Rhiannon had a job. She had a job and she was directly responsible to Sir Brangwen himself. She had to go and find something that's very hard to find. It wasn't a mushroom, but it was kind of like a mushroom. It was found deep in the ground. And she had truffle. And they would go with very, very fancy meats and things like that. And it just so happened that Sir Brangwen absolutely loved them. And she had to collect as many as she could. So she would go out with her basket in the morning and she would fill the basket up if she could. But it was hard. She had to go here. She had to go there. It wasn't like she could find a great big amount of them. Sometimes she went back with nothing. Still, this particular morning she went out and she tried to find some truffles, but she couldn't. And just out of the corner of her eye, she saw something. This beautiful white horse, and it was coming towards her. And she had never seen this before. It was so lovely. It was pure white, no black specks, no nothing like that. Even the hooves were white. And the eyes so bright. And it seemed quite tame, but there were only Rhiannon and this horse nearby. Rhiannon would never go deep into the forest because she would always worry about coming back. And so with this horse coming towards her, he felt strong enough to stroke it. And then she sang, I walk into the forest and you follow, follow, follow. I walk into the forest and you follow, pure and white, eyes so bright. I walk into the forest and you follow. And she stayed there with it, and she was so mesmerized. But one or two of the villagers had seen her as she parted company with this horse, and they were suspicious. But before this horse left, he had pawed the ground and shown her where to find these truffles that were always normally so mysterious to find. And she filled her basket. So there was suspicious right away. There were suspicious minds right away. The head man of the village wanted to know where she'd got all these truffles and how. So she had to tell him what she knew. But well, he kept an eye on things and she went back the next day. But some of the villagers decided to follow her. They thought, well, if they got truffles as well, and there was an abundance of truffles that would be kept for a long time, Sir Brangwen would be so pleased that he would reward the villagers. But they should have known better, because that wasn't Sir Brangwen's style. But well, they had to hope. It was a very difficult situation they were in. But out she went. And some of the villagers were behind. And they were all waiting for this white horse to come and show where the truffles were. But it never came. And it never came. And they got tired and they wanted to go back to their work, because they had to work the land very hard, see to the crops, etc. And it wasn't until Rhiannon was alone that the white horse came out again. I walk into the forest and you follow, follow, follow. I walk into the forest and you follow. Pure and white, eyes so bright.
Oh, Jay.
To the forest and
So
you
much discipline.
So after that, she got more truffles and she took them back. And there was quite a stack, and the tax clerk was due at the end of the week. Now, the tax clerk was directly responsible to Sir Brangwen. And he knew what Sir Brangwen was looking for. He knew that Sir Brangwen would be so pleased with all these truffles. But he would also want to know a bit more about it. And he heard the story of the white pony and the pawing of the ground and how she'd collected all these. So, well, he decided, this tax clerk, who was a very shrewd man, to employ a huntsman to watch what Rhiannon was doing and to see if he could get a close-up of this horse or whatever it was. And then he would have to report back to the tax clerk. So the next time she went into the woods, the huntsman did, shrewdly and very cleverly, stay far enough behind not to be detected. But once the horse had lain down on Rhiannon's lap and she was stroking it and starting to sing, he could see very clearly, because he wasn't very far away at all. He was very close. And he marveled at this animal. Some of the villagers had thought it was maybe a master's pony that had gone astray, that got lost in the forest. Who knows? But the huntsman did his job and reported back to the tax clerk. And the tax clerk heard all about this beautiful white horse with no specks on it at all, pure white. He said, the only thing is, it's not quite perfect. In the middle of his forehead, it's got this bone or hard piece. It kind of juts out a bit. And as soon as the huntsman uttered those words, the tax clerk knew this was not a horse. This was a very young unicorn. And that posed a problem. He paid the huntsman. And he thought to himself, should I go and tell Sir Brangwen? Because he didn't really want any harm to come to this unicorn if it was to be a unicorn. But on the other hand, if someone else got to Sir Brangwen before him and told him what had happened, that they'd found a unicorn in the forest, well, he would be in a terrible place. Sir Brangwen would want to know why the tax clerk hadn't told him first. And he pondered a while. He slept on it, but the next morning he went over to Brangwen Hall and he had to wait in that tall, grand hall with all the animal skins and the antlers on the walls. And Sir Brangwen came down and he started to tell him, he just started to tell him that there could be a unicorn in the forest. And he saw his eyes light up and he shouted his men, and he didn't wait to hear the whole story. and he thundered off into the forest as fast as he could. Well, they looked everywhere, but they couldn't find a unicorn. And then the tax clerk reminded him that there was a maiden involved, a young girl who was 9 years old. She was the one that had found this unicorn. So of course they would try and get her to find this one again, this young animal. But would she be willing? She wasn't willing at all. Her parents were imprisoned. Why should she help Sir Brangwyn? But when it was explained to her that her parents could come to harm, then she gave in. She wasn't pleased at all, but she walked into the forest, and there was like a great brush wall, behind which Sir Brangwyn on his horse and some other of his men were there just waiting. They couldn't be seen because the wall was so high. They were waiting. They were waiting for this beast to come out and come to Rhiannon, and then they would chase. And Rhiannon was so upset about this. She wanted to cry, but what good would that do? But she certainly didn't sing. She just waited, but it did come, and it came quite near, and she stroked it, and she put her arms round its neck. And before you could blink, out came the horses from behind the brush with Sir Brangwyn at the head. And she just leapt up onto the horse, the white horse, and went off into the forest as fast as she could, darting in and out of the trees. But this animal knew its way around the forest, in and out of all the paths, down this way, round that way. Well, there was quite a kerfuffle, and all the villagers could hear, but none of them could see what was going on. And then there was a big crash and a sort of whinnying noise, and horses were just cantering then, they'd slowed. But no one knew what had happened. All the villagers were waiting. So out came Rhiannon, and they plied her with questions, but she was learning very fast, even though she was only the tender age of 9. She was learning that she had the power to withhold information, and she didn't say what had happened. But when she went back that night, they discovered that Sir Brangwyn was dead. He'd fallen off his horse. He'd been speared by something long and sharp. And it wasn't until that point that there was then appointed a new master, a new person who looked at life rather differently to Sir Brangwyn and didn't want to just always be so hard on the people. And consequently, because there was a new master, her parents were set free. And when she saw them that night, it wasn't until then, and she saw them that night, she said, unicorns have parents too. End of.
Lovely. Absolutely lovely. Thank you very much. Yeah. Right, so we go to Mike.
Right then.
Yeah.
I'm afraid after that lovely story, I'm going to really lower the tone. I hope that's not unacceptable. I want to tell a tale about the television journalist, our roving reporter, Fife Robertson. Now, people of an age in Britain will remember Fife Robertson. For our colonial colleagues and young people, I don't know if you can see that at all. Here he is.
Yeah.
Yep, he was as dashing a gentleman as Mike Rust, with his beard and his tweed suits. And he worked on the Tonight programme on BBC. And he would go, our roving reporter, he would go and rove around and interview people. And this one time, he went to see a young shepherd on an island off the coast of Scotland, a young shepherd called Duncan. And the interview started as Fife Robertson's interviews always did, sort of, well, thank you, it's lovely to see you tonight. Now, I'm here with young Duncan here, and we're going to have a wee chat. Sorry for the accent, people, yeah, real Scots people. Now, Duncan, can you tell me what is your job, Duncan? Although he already knew. And Duncan said, well, Fife, I'm a shepherd. I am a shepherd. And Fife said, and do you always live on the island, Duncan? Well, Fife, no, I don't always live on the island. I'm here sort of from March through to October. I don't know what hell accent that was. When there's grass for the sheep. The rest of the time, I'm over on the mainland. And Fife Robertson said, well, so how many sheep do you have, Duncan? And Duncan said, well, I've 500 sheep here. Aye, 500. And Fife said, so Duncan, do you look after the sheep on your own? He said, of my dog. I've old Meg, my dog. Aye, Meg and I, we do it. Aye. And Fife Robertson said, are you the only person on the island? And Duncan said, aye, yeah, aye, yes, Fife, yes, I'm the only person on the island. He said, do you not get lonely? Oh, no. How would I get lonely? Of my sheep and Meg. Fife Robertson said, well, do you not sometimes miss human company? No, Fife, no. There's more sense in sheep than people. I don't want to be indelicate, Duncan, but you, sheep, a dog, no people. Can you tell me, what do you do about sex? And Duncan thought a moment. He said, about sex? I have my dinner, I think. I did say it was lowering the tone.
Thank you very much,
Not
Mike.
at all.
Well, it was lovely told. Like I say, that I'm not sure what the accent was, but it was somewhere north of Shropshire. So.
Most of the time.
Yeah. Right, Norman.
Hello. And I'm sorry I forgot to turn the mute off. I was checking a detail in the story, and because I wanted to, I've forgotten who the story came from the Tlingit people on the West Coast. And this is a bit like the saying. It's an old man, and he lived on the outside of the village, and part of the reason why is that people were separate from him. He was an old, very old man. His children, his grandchildren, all of his children were gone. He was the last surviving member. And nobody knew who he was, really. They didn't come to visit. And one day he was contemplating, I'm useless. Nobody knows me, and I don't know anybody. And he decided to go for a walk up into the mountain. And as he was going up the mountain, he decided, there's grizzlies up this mountain. And I'm sure they're hungry, as every animal is. I know what I'll do. I'm going to go and feed myself to a grizzly. At least I'll be of use to something, for somebody, somehow. And so this cheered him up to have a use. So he went up along the stream, and as he went further up, he saw the outline of a grizzly. And as soon as he was downwind of the grizzly was upwind with him and saw him. The grizzly ran towards him, stopped, stood on both legs, and roared as if to ask, "Who are you and what are you doing?" And there's claws and teeth everywhere. The old man changed his mind about being eaten by a grizzly at that moment. And there's a question that had been asked, or so it seemed. And so with a quivering voice, he said, I've come up the mountain to offer you to a feast for you, a feast of cranberries and salmon in 3 days' time. And the grizzly bear growled as if to say, "Very well, I'll be there, and so will my friends." And it fell to the four legs and went into the shadows of the forest. And the old man stood there for a moment, and this time he ran down the mountain. He came to his dwelling, and he stopped and he thought, "I've just invited a grizzly and his friends for dinner. I better be ready for them when they come." And so he went inside, and there was racks and racks of dried salmon. There was baskets of dried cranberries, and there was pots of salmon fat. And so he began to pound. He pounded the cranberries and he pounded the salmon, and then he mixed the salmon and the cranberries with the salmon fat, and he made enough food for 12 grizzlies. And by then it was the third day, and he set out the food and he waited. And just about mid-afternoon, there came a scratching at his door, and the door burst open, and in came the first grizzly that he had seen, and then a second, a third, a fourth, until his place, which was rather large, I must admit, was full of grizzlies. And they all sat down in front of their plates of salmon, pounded salmon, cranberries, and they began to eat. And they ate, and they growled to each other, no doubt grizzly gossip of the mountains. And after they had eaten their fill, and after they had all licked their paws clean, they all got up, and one by one they went out. The very first one was what seemed to be the old chief grizzly, and then the second and the third, until at last there was 11 gone, and the 12th, the smallest, the youngest, stopped and turned around and spoke in a human voice. Said, "My chief wants me to tell you, to say thank you. Thank you for inviting us to a feast. And he wants to let you know that we too, up in the mountains, can be very lonely. And this feast is most welcome. So thank you." And with that, he turned around, out the door, and into the mountains once more. Now, the people in the village nearby could not help but notice that 12 grizzlies had come out of the forest and into the old man's dwelling. The old man, and they all rushed up to see what the story was. And he told them, "Yes, I feasted 12 grizzlies." And the people thought, well, anybody who can call grizzlies, 12 of them out of the forest, must be a person of some importance. And so from that day on, when anybody had a dispute or a desire for some wisdom or whatever, they would pay him a visit. And he would too. He was old and he was wise. And the people came away wiser and with the wisdom of the old man. And so he spent the rest of his days. He was never alone again. And as for the grizzlies in the forest, they had a story to tell for many years of the time that they were feasted by the old man. And that's that story.
Oh, lovely, Mike. No, lovely, Norman. Thank you. Right, well, it's only 7:25, and I think everybody's done a story but me, basically. So I'm going to finish off tonight by doing a story myself. But I'm afraid, Heather and Diana, it's not one from Stanley because I've been away for the weekend and I haven't had time to think about it. But there are a couple more that I can beginning to come about, snakes and werewolves and things and vampires in the Highlands, but not tonight. Because the British Isles is a big place, left, right and centre. But down on the southwest, there's a place called Cornwall. And Cornwall, there's the north shore of Cornwall, and the Atlantic hits the granite there, and there's always a competition between the sea and the rocks. And it's a beautiful place, and the people are rugged. But in one of those villages on the north shores there, a family had come down from London. And it was the longest day, and it was the shortest night, and they'd got a little cottage And this was years ago, just between the wars in the last century. But the villagers came and they knocked on the door and they said, you have to go to bed tonight as the sun comes down, and don't get up until the sun comes up in the morning. Because the legend of the local village is this: at the end of the cliff, there are 3 standing stones. And those 3 standing stones are the Daughters of Merlin. And Merlin had arranged for them to be married, but they didn't want to get married to the people he'd arranged for, so he got cross and he turned them into stone. And he put them out on the end of the cliff, and they said, when you decide to get married to the people I want you to get married to, I'll turn you back into beautiful women again. But he got this, even as good as Merlin was, he got the spell a little bit wrong. There was a weakness to it. And as the sun came down on the shortest night and the longest day, they'd come in and they'd go down to the sea and they'd try and wash the stone from their skin, but they could never make it. So as the sun came back out on that dawn, they'd go back, and for another year, they'd stand at the end of the cliff. But if you saw them move, if you saw them, then you would surely die. One way or another, you would not survive. For that was the legend of Merlin and his 3 daughters of the standing stones. And they told the little family this. Well, they all went to bed, and the mother went round and locked all the doors and everything else. And there was a little boy, and he was about 12 years old. But he knew his father. And he'd heard his father say, as he picked up a whiskey and drink it, he said, who believes in storytellers and myths and stories? What a load of cobweb. Well, the little boy, he woke, and he snuck into his parents' room, and his dad wasn't there, but the window was open, and he hopped out the window and he ran to the end of the cliff. And just as he looked over to the cliff, he thought he saw the 3rd stone just click back into place. And then the sun came up, and there on the beach was a body. And he knew who that body was straight away. And he went and got his mother, and they roused the village, and they came down and they found his father there. And there's a coroner's report to this day that it was on the day of the longest day and the shortest night, and someone was killed on the beach. And it seemed that he'd been ground together by stones or smashed by stones. It was probably the waves that picked him up and thrown him onto the stones like the North Sea, the Atlantic does in Cornwall, and battered and busted and crushed him and finished him off. But the villagers knew what had happened, but they never said a word. And the family, they went back to London. Well, the little boy, he went to the university and he got his exams, and he went to be a banker in London. And he started off in a small bank, but by the time he'd finished, he was 65 years old. He owned this great big bank, and he was full of money. And he had a wife and he had children, but he'd never been to the seashore before again. Never once he'd been anywhere near the sea at any time. But he lived in a wooden house made with wooden nails, and it had a thatch to it, and he had a wooden fence around it, and he lived in the middle of a forest, and he never went anywhere near stones of any kind at all. But it came for him to retire. His wife had died and his children were working away, and he thought, I need to lay this ghost to myself. So all he did was he sold everything up, and he took a boat from Liverpool and he went to New York, and he traveled right away across America. And he came to where the coast in the Pacific comes down, and he turned left and he went down the coast to a bit of land that sort of south of America sticks out into the ocean, and it's a part of Mexico. And it's standing there, and he bought this place that overlooked the Pacific Ocean. And he looked round and he thought, well, I'll spend the rest of my days here. If anybody wants to come and visit me, they can. I'm just going to stay here. And he sat out overlooking the view of the green, of the blue ocean in front of him. And he got himself a drink, and he drank gin and tonics like all bankers do. And he was starting to drink, and he looked up and he looked round, and behind the thorn hedge, he looked up, and there was a tall standing stone. And he put a shiver down his spine, and he looked up again, and it seemed that this tall standing stone wasn't that side of the hedge, it was this side of the hedge. And he looked up, he went to sleep, and he drank a bit more, and he looked at the ocean, and he looked round again, and the tall standing stone seemed to be a bit closer. And he jumped up, and he put his glass on the wall, and he put his hands on the wall. As he put the hands on the wall seemed to fade away, and it grabbed his hands. And suddenly in front of him, because he couldn't move, there was a tall standing stone, and it just touched his nose once. Now they say there's a house overlooking the Pacific, and you've got to go to the western part of America, and you turn left and you go down, and there's a bit of land that sticks out into the ocean, and there's a house. And by the house, there's a tall standing stone. And this standing stone sometimes moves, but only moves on the longest day and the shortest night. And it goes down into the sea, and it seems to be trying to wash itself. But it never seems to do anything, but it always comes back and always stands there all by itself. And the local people there say they don't know where it comes from. The standing stones of Cornwall, to do with Merlin and all that. So it's been a pleasure to be in your company again. I think everybody who's told a story wants to tell a story. Emily, it's been lovely to be with you again. I pick you out because you're young and good looking and beautiful. Okay. And the rest of us have got white beards, and Mike, yeah, I get that. And of course there's Heather and there's Diane, because all the women in the Highlands are beautiful. That's what Stanley Robinson always used to start his stories by saying. So I'll be here in a fortnight's time, which I think is the bank holiday, but it doesn't matter. I will still be here anyway. Okay, and it's always a pleasure to see you. And the year is turning. I looked up this morning, and the swallows, we have swallows here, and they come in the spring and they go in the autumn. And before they go, they always sit on the wires, and it's a harbinger that the summer is ending, the autumn is coming. And I saw them this morning. There must have been 20 of them all sat on the wires, and the year is beginning to turn again, and that's one of the signs we have in Shropshire. So it's a pleasure to be with you all again. So I'm going to call it tonight, unless anybody's got any questions for me, and I'll see you all.
Just want to say, Mike, sometimes you remind me of Alfred Hitchcock. I don't know if you, yes, because of the way you tell stories. It's just something. Whenever he told a story or would end his show, there was always a slight air of mystery, like you were waiting for him to say something more, and you had that air about you. I mean, even if you said the end, there would be that air that no, it isn't. So that's a compliment, Mike.
I take it as a compliment, and from you it is definitely a compliment, Baba. And thank you very much for making my day better.
Thank you.
Thank
you all.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
And I look forward to meeting you all again. And Heather, I promise to think about Stanley Robinson again. I know there's another story knocking around, and I hope, and you, Diane, as well. These are gifts that were given to me. And I promise to keep thinking about it. Okay.
Mike, can I just remind people the young storytellers are on at 5 o'clock on Tuesday. So
Yeah.
worth tuning into. They're wonderful.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. I look forward. It's a bad,
Tell
time,
long and
bad
prosper.
time of the day on a bad day for me to listen to stories, but I will try and get there at one point, I promise. Okay. And Susan, listening to South African stories, it's beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone. Night, night.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Tell long and prosper.
Right. Live long and prosper.
Ali, thank you very much, mate.
Thank
My
you,
thanks
Ali.
to Ali for being here and doing everything again.
And this meeting of the White Beards
Thank
is
you,
now
Ali.
concluded. Thank you,
Okay.
ladies.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Until the next time.